and again, plays right into understanding exactly what are the contours of things like the European Union, which we're going to learn a lot about today, and a lot more. So I'm going to do part one. It's going to be about an hour, 10 minutes, I think. We'll have a little bit of a dialogue afterwards, and very short as Cynthia's transitioning. We'll do part two. And by that time, people should be hungry, and we'll both feed our minds and our bellies by ordering food and just having dialogue here as long as you guys want, or until we get too tired, whichever comes first. So for my component of today's presentation, it's gonna be a weird ride, but that's expected. It's called Introduction to Occult Geopolitics, Part 1, Breaking Out of the Alchemical Trap. So that's a tentative name. The challenge that I set forth, I kind of realized a few days ago that, well, I was going to do the whole thing on occult geopolitics, and then I realized, well, it's one on the verge of Canada Day, we're on the verge of July 4th, Independence Day. So that's a pretty important thing to say something about, considering the decisions that led into both of those events in 1776 and 1867 are extremely relevant in also understanding the contours of our current world. We're gonna fold this into the discussion somehow. The purposes that I want people to sort of walk away with in varying degrees are, number one, I want people to understand the oligarchical force shaping world history. Who doesn't know what the word oligarchy means? Everybody's initiated, okay? That's actually not even the right word, I don't think. The more I think about it, I got a friend who made the point that oligos just means rule by the few. That could be good or could be bad, really. But he made the point that what we should really get used to calling the thing that's running our transatlantic world should be the kakistocracy, which is basically rule by the worst. And I agree with him. I think that's...
How do you spell that?
Yeah.
The caucus?
That's a good creative license there. Number two, we want to implicitly understand its methods, its modus operandi, how does it work, what is it afraid of, and thus understand what type of thinking has broken its programming looking at history from the standpoint of this battle of freedom against slavery, of master against slave systems of control, right? So those are the sorts of lessons I'm hoping people walk away from this presentation with. Ben Franklin, the father of the founding fathers, made the point that those who would sacrifice liberty for security deserve neither. I think that's as true then as it is today. The Declaration of Independence, something that as Canadian I didn't really appreciate, and I think that has a lot to do with what has been controlling the education system that I was indoctrinated with, which kind of like posited, and I don't know if this is the same in the West Coast as it was where I was born in the East Coast, but I had this view embedded inside of my head that the Americans were inferior to Canadians because they knew that they didn't have the patience to know that the overbearing mother of the empire was going to eventually give us freedoms if we just waited patiently and were a little bit more obedient. They chose to like drop blood and like create a mess, and now they're an empire. Look at them. What a shame. Vietnam. But no, there's much more to it. I was So we have, that was, I think, designed, that narrative was put into my head in order to give me a false sense as a Canadian that there is nothing to learn from the experiences of 1776 that I had no emotional connection with. But when you read not only the founding documents, the Declaration, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And that's, of course, a painting of Franklin with Adams, Jefferson overseeing one of the many redraftings of this document that was part of the Continental Congress set up in 1774 as an organizing principle to define what would be this new nation that had tried so hard over years and years to find reconciliation with the British Empire, to make the mother country in England become more less hostile to the aspirations of the colonists to venture outside of their boundary conditions of the colonies and have industries, have manufacturing that they were never permitted to have, that were always being sabotaged by the dumping of cheap goods from London, and the sabotage by the City of London as the global center of power financially then as it is today. So this was like done at the end of a long string of abuses that became irreconcilable through negotiation. Obviously, for Albertans, this speaks pretty deeply. The preamble of the Constitution, I think, is also very important. Again, another amazing orchestration by Benjamin Franklin. There's a painting of him there with Hamilton and Washington standing up, which are seen legally as two sides of the exact same idea, which holds that we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. And of course, the idea of the unalienable rights of the individual, the sacredness of the individual, and the idea of the general welfare as outlined in the Constitution, although are treated as two opposing principles by idiots today who don't know how to reconcile the fact that we both live as a community, but also we have inalienable freedoms as individuals, that was understood to be not a paradox for the Founding Fathers. They were much higher quality philosophical thinkers than many of those who are managing today's shit show. Sorry for the baby. I'm hoping I'm not planting like subliminal bad words in its psyche. But so the idea is that you could only actualize your true sovereign rights as a citizen if you were taking on the responsibilities of the society as a whole, right? If you looked in the mirror and saw an expression of the government, and that when you had an informed moral opinion that you would act upon in the world, you were also expressing natural law as the individual. So it wasn't like you had one sovereign giving liberties to people, but rather you had everybody recognize that we are all sovereign under certain conditions. Right, that we have responsibilities that we recognize and own. If we don't, then we're subjects. That's a different thing. Now let's compare that to Canada. Our British North America Act, given to us after a booze-soaked party on the Maritimes, and then was ratified in London in 1867, states that whereas the provinces of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick have expressed their desire to be federally united into one dominion under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom, and whereas such a union would conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire. Okay, that's a weird one. And it's a contract. It's a contract which, when you read the language as a whole, it's based upon the idea that we have rights, sure, but the rights are given to us by a sovereign and implicitly can be thus taken away by said sovereign if the expedient so arose. Also, the idea that the purpose of the government is to secure the welfare of the British Empire is a weird one. It enshrines things like Privy Council, the unelected aspects of the government, the Governor General's office, the Privy Council, as governing bodies baked into our very own fabric of our nation. That's a weird one too, that would be there from the get-go. It really lacks something very special. So what does it need to be founded upon British imperial principles? Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is as sort of an in, as we begin this weird little tour of history, is look at a few anomalies. I like picking up anomalies and thinking about them. A lot of people, they see anomalies and they let it just slide right by. Let's not do that. One anomaly, I mentioned the City of London as a center of global power in 1776 as it is today. That's not a joke. That's a serious thing. There's a film called The Spider's Web. It was made, I think, by a few British filmmakers about 8 years ago, and it's fantastic at just showcasing what is the City of London. Who has never looked into the weirdness of the City of London? I mean, a city within a city, the square mile.
I see that movie. Okay.
You seen it? Oh, that's good. Most people here are pretty familiar with this thing. That's good. Not at all. Okay, well, you'll become more familiar. So within the cities, when I talk about London and the Lord Mayor of the City of London, I'm not talking about London, the capital of England. I'm talking about the city which is the financial center of the world, which houses the Bank of England. And the city has certain special jurisdictions akin to the Vatican City, very similar, in the sense that they have their own police, they have their own jurisdiction, they have their own courts, they have a mandate above that of the nation of England per se as a nation. It's very strange.
Well, they have the crown as well.
The crown is still, yeah, but the crown still has to bend the knee.
Yeah, but the
So the
physical
Roman
crown is.
Oh, the physical crown is located there. The Royal Society is located there, yeah. As well, the Royal Society headquarters that controls so much of the standards of modern science is located there. What we have there is a picture of the London fire of 1666 that raged for 3 days, destroying much of what is today located in that square mile. And it was rebuilt. And what you have there on your right is the figures of the protectors of the City of London. You can Google this. This is the official protectors of the City of London, Gog and Magog. On the shield of Gog over there is a phoenix rising out of the ashes, which is a theme that you'll find for those who followed Cynthia's work especially. Uh-oh, batteries are dead.
Gotcha.
All right, you on it? Thank you.
That was good.
It looks like material atmosphere.
Yeah, really, yeah. Yeah, I think that their inspiration from things like Game of Thrones comes from a lot of this real history. So anyway, you've got Gog and Magog as the protectors officially of the City of London, based upon an idea of phoenixing. Every year around the same time, don't ask me what time, since the 13th century, there's been a strange parade held in London featuring Gog and Magog as these two effigies trucked down by normal people who don't think about weird crap that's in their face that can tell them a lot about the world that they live in if they thought about it. But it's tradition, so you don't think about tradition. You just go with the that's fast. You just go with the flow. Part of the City of London has its exceptional powers above that of the nation state that were enshrined in something known as the Magna Carta of 1215. Now, within the Magna Carta, although it's often celebrated as the foundation of liberties and things like the U.S. Constitution and Declaration of Independence, in my research, I would say no. What you did have, though, 200 years before this was, or almost 200 years before this Magna Carta, was something of a Norman invasion of England that involved the installation of feudalism for the very first time, which meant that basically for the first time, the individuals living on a certain land that was owned by a landlord would be the property of those landlords, would be basically an appendage of, just like the cows were an emanation of the land or something, so too would the individual humans be kind of like the cows. And a bunch of these feudal barons, or these Norman robber barons as they call themselves, who created things like the Doomsday Book, the book that allocated plots of land that enshrined the foundations of many of the noble families of England today, which do tend to go back to this like Viking takeover. The Normans were, after all, the Northmen. The Northmen were the Vikings, and that has a direct continuity to something that happened when Rome collapsed, and certain convergence of forces happened around the 5th century, which we'll talk about, and we're going to get wind of this as I go forward. But within the Magna Carta, it states explicitly that the City of London shall have all of its ancient liberties and free customs by land as well as by water. Furthermore, we decree and grant that all other cities, boroughs, towns, and ports shall have all their liberties and free customs. Earls and barons shall be immersed only by their peers and only in proportion with the degree of the offense. Basically, it's the Norman barons that brought in feudalism that said only we can self-regulate. We can regulate each other as peers, but anybody that has to do with the state, the nation, has no say or right to rein us in, to say what we can't do. It was basically the right to basically pillage and not be held accountable by any form of law. Now, I mentioned here the third element, which is another weird one, is that the City of London, i.e. the square mile that I'm referring to, is also known as the former Isis cult, as a temple, Druidic Roman pagan system managed since 46 AD, when Rome invaded England and created Roman Londinium. And for a while, Rome had on their hands the pagan Roman emperors that had just established an empire system out of the ashes of a republic, had trouble with the Druidic, groupings, the pagan groupings that had some weird practices of human sacrifice, but they had some problems trying to rein them in. And at a certain point, an agreement was reached, and a convergence, an alliance was set, which would co-manage in order to destroy Christianity together, because they both realized that they both have a common enemy, which is the newly forming Christian movement. So the Isis temple is known today, and people can look into this. I talk about this in the books. That was the center of the City of London. That was where the Isis temple that ran the Roman Londinium was based, which is also why Thames, to this very day, is also known. You can go on Wikipedia, you can go on any England tourism website, is also known as River Isis. River Isis is where a bunch of figures who would create a certain cult called Theosophy in 1876 chose to set up the obelisk, the Cleopatra's Needle, flanked by two sphinxes right there on the River Thames, which is also a node right next to a certain building that housed the headquarters of Theosophy, and one Mabel Collins that we talk about in our book that's very much tied to Jack the Ripper, but that's a whole other conversation. Sorry, yeah. Give me a lot of those kinds of things, I'm sorry. That's just another picture from a London tourism website, the ISIS, the River Thames, Oxford. Now keep in mind also, and Cynthia's class is going to implicitly, maybe not explicitly, but implicitly touch upon the fact that in Paris, you have the sister ISIS temple, which was where the very name Paris got its name, from Para Isis, those who were from ISIS, originally in around the 3rd century AD. So that ties into some weird stuff that happened at the Olympics in the opening ceremonies. So, okay, I wrote a book not that long ago called The Venetian Angle of the British Empire. Because the British Empire wasn't always an empire. England had something very valid and beautiful inside of it. And that shouldn't be overlooked either, right? So what exactly caused this nation that had these pagan problems to lose its republican heritage, the aspirations of people like Thomas More, like Henry VII, who gave rise to the world's first modern nation state, of Erasmus and of people like Shakespeare? What caused their influence to dissipate in favor of this other entity that began to take control and use England as the expression or projection of power? Well, here the Venetian role becomes an important one, and these things converge. Benjamin Disraeli, himself a practicing occultist who was Prime Minister of England for a time, he stated something very interesting that caught my eye, when he was talking about England, and especially the period after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. He describes how the great object of the Whig leaders in England, from the first movement under Hampden to the last more successful one in 1688, was to establish in England a high aristocratic republic on the model of the Venetian. Two great Whig nobles, Argyll and Somerset, brought in a new family on their own terms. George I, that's a Hanoverian George, the first king was a Hanoverian king, was a doge. George II was a doge. They were what William III, a great man, would not be. George III tried not to be a doge, but it was impossible materially to resist the deeply laid combination. He might get rid of the Whig Magnificos, but he could not rid himself of the Venetian Constitution. What does that mean? What does that mean? Let's go see. All right, so what is Venice? Well, let's just take a step back. I don't do the linear thing, as people might have guessed. I don't do linear things. We're going to bounce a bit, but that's okay. So Venice. Before Britain was known as the empire in which the sun never set, before that happened, the dominant world empire that controlled maritime trade with influence all the way to Asia was known as Venice. Otherwise, it called itself the most serene republic. It was nominally a republic, but in name only. And we're going to see something about that. That's some of their acquisitions at their height. Actually, no, they were starting to descend in power at this point, but still, it gives you a sense of the type of trade corridors that they had access to, controlling influencing the Ottomans. They had access to, pretty much they were the monopoly, especially when they took over from Genoa. They're at one time rival that later on merged. So what was Venice? The idea of the Venetians, here's one thing I should say before I do this, is that Venice was also the home that was selected in the armpit of Italy, right up there. And that was the home selected as one of the primary domains of the Roman patrician families as the Western Roman Empire was collapsing. Those who wanted to pick up their wares and try to rebuild their empire in the West found Venice their dominant home. Another city-state that was built up around the 6th and 7th centuries by a lot of these patrician families was Amalfi. Another was Genoa, but Venice became the dominant one. They had a few centuries of rivalry, but at a certain point, Venice proved itself to be just the best at being bad. And they were the ones who took over control. But they were largely the new phase of the Roman Empire. So their aim was to rebuild and establish a new global Roman Empire. Again, under the term the Serene Republic, they were called serene just because they never had any uprisings from within Venice. Their ability to maintain control on the culture and on the governing class was so intense that the only single time you ever had a doge that attempted to carry a conspiracy to upset the order, he was caught within 2 seconds and was publicly beheaded in St. Mark's Square. In like the early 14th century, it never happened again. The way it was organized was you had a doge, basically that guy taming the lion holding the book looking sad. That's actually another picture of a more recent doge with his strange hat. It's called the horned hat, but it was also known as the Phrygian cap. You had the doge, lifelong appointment. Underneath him, you had the Committee of Three and the Committee of 10. The Committee of Three had full rights to make disappear anybody who they wanted to in the Republic. Anybody, and we're going to say something about that too. The Committee of 10, and then the Senate. The Senate was only open to male members of the particular limited array of leading Italian families. So you had a certain set of families. If you were from them, you could become a senator. Otherwise, forget about it. So a very, very absolute glass ceiling from the plebes to the elites. It was an oligarchy. It was a kakistocracy, a kakistocratic oligarchy.
You could say that again.
Please don't ask me to. So what did they do? How did they get power? Well, one thing that they did is they bankrolled the Crusades. They were known as the center of global bullion trade. So they controlled the flow of gold, silver bullion, maritime trade. They had the most sophisticated intelligence network on the earth. This is what Shakespeare was exposing in things like Othello, with the Venetian intelligence operative Iago, who destroys everybody around him that he despises, like Othello, like Othello's wife, like Othello's friend, everybody, by profiling them and getting them to exhibit the worst weaknesses of their personality that they hadn't rectified. And by profiling people, you're able to bring about the worst aspects of them and get everybody to destroy everybody, and you don't have to do very much. And the Venetians were very good at that. You saw the same type of principle of the Venetian method in The Merchant of Venice, again by Shakespeare. So there are certain ways that great Republican artists have exposed this and treated this at various times. James Fenimore Cooper, that Cynthia did a wonderful class on, did a book in the 1810s called The Bravo, about the story of a Venetian assassin that did a comparison that Cooper was doing between what a legitimate republic is and should become versus what a fake republic is that Venice was for the early American founding fathers and just American citizens that needed to know, well, what are we, right? What is a culture of citizenry? They bankrolled the Crusades, like I said, the forever wars that went on for centuries of Christians killing Jews, killing Muslims fighting back, killing Christians. You had just a revenge of different cultures. Forever was the idea. I don't think that was ever supposed to end. But it resulted in a complete breakdown of the social fabric, a loss of cultural traditions that were viable, and a brutalization of the people to the point that whole practices, like I said, of having just free citizens was lost. The idea of literacy for the masses that people like Charlemagne had advanced, or King Alfred in the 9th century had advanced to a certain degree, were lost completely. You had also the Mongols, the fact that the Venetian Marco Polo and his father were both advisors to Thank you, Khan, the fourth Khan after Genghis, that were granted the only access to to Mongolian controlled territories as the Mongol hordes, the Golden Hordes, were expanding into every kingdom that they set their sights on. They dominated from Persia to India to China all the way through Russia to the borders of Hungary. Everywhere was just success, and the only people that were able to trade under their territories were the Venetians, no one else. And I think that was a reciprocal relationship, where the Venetians were, with their best intelligence agency, with penetrations throughout each of the courts of Europe and beyond, and the Muslim world, were able to provide very sound intelligence to the Mongols that were then used. And my hypothesis is that they were used in a very similar way as ISIS and Al-Qaeda have been used by Western intelligence agencies as proxies, battering rams, to destroy target nations and erase civilizational traditions, museums and other things. That hasn't been done over the past 40 years, especially the last 20 years. Venice, okay, so I mentioned Phrygian cap. not only did you have the merger of the Amalfi Center, so Amalfi was another city-state, which we're going to see something about in a second, they're important. They had a certain flag that became used by a new, I would say, Gnostic, pseudo-Christian order of mercenaries called the Knights Hospitaller in 1098, or 98. And they changed their name to the Sovereign Order of Malta under Venetian influence. Venice was a key headquarters of the Sovereign Order of Malta even before it took on that name. They had massive influence into the Habsburg courts that dominated and introduced a Jesuit control over Christianity from 1534 when the Jesuits were set up. Largely through a Venetian operation when Ignatius Loyola was on a pilgrimage having gotten traumatized in a certain Spanish war as a Spanish mercenary. He had been very crippled, traumatized, and he had certain guiding handlers who brought him into certain initiatory practices or experiences in caves. And then came out with this obsession to create a new order, a new Christian order, and also to do a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He found himself in St. Mark's Square, which is the center of Venice. And as the story officially goes, one of the leading Venetian noblemen heard an angel come to his bedside saying, "How could you let a holy man sit in the cold and the rain outside in St. Mark's Square while you're lying comfortably in blankets and down pillows here?" And he went outside and found Ignatius Loyola and brought him, cleaned him up, and introduced him to the Doge of Venice, who was so moved by his story that he paid for Loyola to go to the Holy Land with an entourage provided by Venice and to come back and set up his order. So that's the story, at least. That's the official story. In fact, how much that's actually true, I doubt. A lot, maybe the outward form of it. And Venice and Genoa, though they were enemies at various times, did have a harmonized common interest that we'll talk about too. Now, the four dominant city-states that were sometimes rivals, sometimes allies throughout the 7th to 13th centuries or 14th centuries are upper left, lion, that's Venice, right? That's the Templar, well, it looks a lot like the Templar symbol of the Red Cross. Later it becomes St. George's Cross, and that was Genoa. The empire, the first dominant empire of the seas. On the bottom left-hand side there is Malta, or at the time it was Amalfi. So that's the Order of Malta's sign that came from the city of Amalfi, which also owned things like the Isle of Capri, a major cult center of the world. I don't remember what the bottom right-hander was, probably not good. And there, for those who doubt, that is actually the Great Priory of the Order of Malta. They got a name change. They were formerly known as the Knights Hospitaller from 1098 up until 1530. So they did a little bit of a name rebranding at a certain point, but they're the same thing. Their logo is located right there. I think Cynthia might have a word to say as well about the configuration of the angel wings, sword, and shield. And yeah, it's a couple of examples of some of their soldiers in combat gear. Now keep in mind, just like the Knights Templar that were co-created around the exact same time to oversee the first and the second and the third and the fourth crusade, just like the fact that they were both created by leaders within the Benedictine order, which is important. Most of the members of each order were not actually mercenaries. They were not actually soldiers or combatants. 9 out of 10 Templars and 9 out of 10 members of the Order of Malta were administrators, right? They're bankers, and the Knights Templar, the sister order to the Knights of Malta, sometimes rival but often collaborator, ended up controlling the vast majority of global banking and commerce throughout the Crusades.
I'm not going to bring it up, but just say it now. It's the Gladio symbol.
Yes, for those, what Cynthia just said is she won't necessarily bring it up in her main presentation, but for those who don't know, that is the symbol that was selected for Operation Gladio. Who doesn't know what Operation Gladio is? Okay, if anybody looks into what happened to most of the leading Nazis and Italian and French fascists after World War II, they didn't get punished at Nuremberg. They got cozy new jobs and assignments under Alan Dulles and British intelligence to manage things like NATO, and to basically manage what became known, especially by the 80s and 90s, as NATO's secret armies. So global clandestine paramilitary organizations, highly centralized to overthrow governments we don't like, that utilize hardcore Nazi Italian killers, Nazi and Italian, Mussolini Italian killers. And that was Operation Gladio that had a symbol, and that symbol was that.
The center of the shield?
No,
No, not the center, just a shield motif.
the wings with the sword.
Yeah.
With the wings and the sword, and then they have a parachute because they would parachute into enemy territory in clandestine warfare.
There you go. Yeah, so no crown, no Malta thing, no star of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at the bottom. That wasn't there, but maybe implicitly it was.
I'm good right now.
When the Hospitaller Order was set up in Malta in 1530, 4 years before the setup of the Jesuits and 4 years before the creation of the Anglican Church, again, brought to us by the Venetians, and there's a whole story about that, which I won't have time to go into. You had a rebranding on the flag level, where they basically took the inversion of the Genoa and St. George flag and basically turned the colors inside out, calling that the official flag of Malta. And on the left-hand side is the other flag of the sovereign order of the actual order itself. So that's Malta, the nation, or the sovereign nation, and that's the order itself of the Crusader order, which is the only Italian order to have on its flag English words literally in that little cross symbol for gallantry on the George cross is literally what it says. Why is that? What is St. George? Well, we know one of the highest honors that are bestowed upon servants of the British Empire since 1883 has been the Order of St. Michael and St. George. That's what Sir Henry Kissinger got in 1990. That's what Sir George Bush received in 1994 for services to the Empire. They were made Knights of the Order of St. George and St. Michael. What is that? What is this? Because it seems to be a motif that comes in and out. Well, on the left-hand side is a painting, a rendition of St. George killing a dragon, him being usually on a horse. On the right is St. Michael, an archangel/saint. It's kind of a weird configuration that had a cult set up around it back in the 1580s. And he's usually portrayed killing either a dragon representing Lucifer or some form of a demon representing Lucifer or a snake, but usually a dragon. And there are two very common symbols. Both of them have been used very much as guiding inspiration for many crusaders as well, based on the idea that we, the righteous Christians, must go and kill heretics who are the dragons. Right? And this is what John Quincy Adams was warning early Americans not to do. He said we must never allow ourselves to go out seeking monsters to destroy. What he was warning is this tendency to romanticize being a knight in shining armor, which always works to make idiots go off and fight wars for bankers. Whenever we get the idea that, look, those others that we don't understand, they speak another language, they are the devil, right? Because they don't worship our God, they are the other, and thus they must be destroyed for us to be righteous instruments of God's will. Did you say Quebec?
Nope.
Quebec is the devil. We got problems. We got problems.
That's our program.
Albert Pike is a fascinating one. He says a lot about this. He wrote a book called The Morals and Dogma in 1871. Albert Pike was a confidant of Giuseppe Mazzini. Mazzini being somebody who organized the proto-color revolutionary program in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, working inside of London with Lord Palmerston, that turned revolutionary organizations that were trying to just have more freedom into battering rams to upset governments that were rivals of the British Empire. And so he had these young European groups, young Albania, young Ukraine, young Ottomans, young Germany, young Italy. Young America. And the Young America branch was then represented in America by none other than Albert Pike, who later on not only became the head Grand Master of the Scottish Rite Freemasonry, but also became the co-founder of the KKK after the Civil War was done. He was a Confederate general. And he was a correspondent with Giuseppe Mazzini. Yeah.
Oh, nice guy.
Yeah, really, really. Yeah, you want to have him babysit your kids, for sure.
Walmart?
What was that?
I thought he was the founder of Walmart.
No, they thought it was a Walden or something. What's this? So he said something about this that I think is useful. In his Morals and Dogma, 1871, he wrote, in 1118, 9 Knights Crusaders in the East, among whom were Geoffroy de Saint-Omer and Hugh de Payenne, consecrated themselves to religion and took an oath between the hands of the Patriarch of Constantinople, a see always secretly or openly hostile to that of Rome, from the time of Photius, The avowed object of the Templars was to protect the Christians who came to visit the holy places. Their secret object was the rebuilding of the Temple of Solomon in the model prophesied by Ezekiel. This rebuilding, formally predicted by the Judaizing mystics of the early ages, had become the secret dream of the patriarchs of the Orient. The Temple of Solomon, rebuilt and consecrated to the Catholic worship, would become, in effect, the metropolis of the universe. The East would prevail over the West, and the patriarchs of Constantinople would possess themselves of the papal power.
Wow.
That's an interesting statement to make.
You think?
Yeah. And keep in mind, when the Crusade began, the whole idea was to create exactly, which was there, the largest magnitude of Christian control over Jerusalem as a kingdom during the 200 years of Crusades. That had a certain flag, even though there were a bunch of different competing baronials, nominally Christian, but kind of, not really. They used a certain symbol of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, 5 crosses, the 4 crosses and the big one. And the Templars, as the story goes, found themselves in headquarters in Solomon's Mines. So that was sort of their base of operation, the holy site of Solomon's Mines and the underground sort of remnants of Solomon's Temple that was destroyed in 70 AD after the Jewish-Roman War. So there was this idea of rebuilding it, and these guys were obsessed with that idea. And there was something that they learned when they encountered an order that had just been built up, that had pre-existed them, called the Order of the Hashashins, otherwise known as the Order of the Assassins. The Assassins got their name because, well, as it worked out, as part of the brainwashing operation that they would be subjected to as initiates after they were set up, was the consumption of massive amounts of hashish as part of an altered state experience before they would be deployed to go on a targeted kill of a leader, whether Muslim or whether Christian, often both. They started working with the Templars, who seem to have taken on similar symbolism that was already used, the red and the white motifs of the Hashashin uniforms, the degrees of initiation of the Hashashins were adopted by the Templars as their own degrees of initiation, as an initiatory cult. So, upon the first success of the First Crusade, you had the Order of Hospitallers, like I mentioned. They were the Order of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem. St. John was their patron saint. The Order of the Holy Sepulchre was set up at the same time. They still exist, and they actually run many of the educational institutions in and around the Middle East to this very day. You can go on their website. It's a strange thing. The Order of Solomon's Temple, like I said, was set up by another guy, Bernard de Clairvaux, a radical Benedictine who became a founding Cistercian, which is basically just more radical Benedictines. And he set up this thing with Mary Magdalene as the patron saint. So one of the things that these guys also had in mind was, I'll just say it now, okay. What was that?
When was this?
This is 1118 when he set this up.
This is Mary Magdalene, Jesus, like.
But see, that's the thing, right? So these are Gnostics. So they're holding a public teaching, and what's called an exoteric teaching, which abides by the public, non-initiated belief in the public Bible. And then they have an esoteric inner teaching belief, which is different from what they allow the public to see, which is based on the Gnostic idea that the real teachings are located in the Gnostic texts of what were later on revealed publicly in the Nag Hammadi sort of find after World War II. But the Nag Hammadi texts are what more clearly portray, they were all written between the 2nd and 4th century AD, and they portray this story that Jesus did not die on the cross, that he had sex and babies with Mary Magdalene that were raised in the southern France, and that became the founders of the Merovingian bloodline, the Merovingians being the sorcerer kings, the pagan sorcerer kings, that had an arrangement after the Western Roman Empire collapsed. And those particular families, specifically the Merovingians, were granted the rights to have managerial control over what became a Frankish kingdom. And they had a bit of a coup d'etat that I went through in my last presentation at this location with Charlemagne and his grandfather Charles Martel, who didn't like them for good reason, ousted them. And as the story goes that they created for themselves is that they are the bloodlines of Christ. Right, and that's where it legitimized in their minds the hereditary systems of the European nobility. is that they all are descendants to varying degrees of purity of the blood, literally, of Jesus. That's, again, I'm not saying I believe that. I'm saying that that's the story that they tell themselves to justify and perpetuate their own sick inbreeding system of control.
They're full of themselves.
Literally, yeah. That's a good.
So good they believe their own bullshit.
Yeah. I like that they're full of themselves there. That's sick and fun. Yeah, Hexeth. All right. So just to say, it's not just about the past, right? When we're reading about the stuff, we have to keep in mind a lot of this stuff has impact in some way on things that are influencing current decision making in the real world that we're living in. The fact that you got the Defense Secretary of the United States with strange choices of tattoos on his chest, emulating both Richard Lionheart, who set forth the anyway. Richard Lionheart was the first sort of king that went into the Holy Land that inspired things like the creation of the Order, the Garter, the later Edward VII, who went back to the Holy Land for as the second king and tattooed the Kingdom of Jerusalem crosses on his chest. That's what inspires Hexeth, who said several times that it's his life's mission to rebuild Solomon's temple when he was last in Israel. So you got things like that, right? Now I'm not saying he's defining or determining anything, but the fact that he would be allowed a psych job like that would be permitted to be in a position of major influence, who also wrote a book called American Crusade, based on an idea that MAGA, which originally existed because Americans got sick of being represented by neo-crusading, neocon former Trotskyists who were trying to revive the Crusades with Dick Cheney and George Bush. That the fact that Americans woke up and rejected that is what created MAGA, and the fact that you got guys like that trying to now co-opt and represent it again, and in his own book he's talking about the necessity to bring about the oncoming crusade against also China as well as the Middle East, or the Muslim world. That's not to be ignored. Now the question is, does Trump actually just manage him and keep him in the wayside, right? And as allowing him to be there without any influence, or does he actually have influence? I don't know that, but it's a factor. Another thing, we talked about the Archangel Michael thing. Babe, are you okay if I go on for like 30 more minutes?
Of course.
Okay. I thought I could get this done like an hour. I can't. There's no way. All right.
The true arc of power is
All right, so here we got the Apollo St. Michael axis. Apollo being a solar deity, a prototype for Lucifer later on, fallen solar deity. Horus being another solar deity, but they're all basically refurbished forms of the exact same entity that was a big part of the organization of ancient pagan mystery cults. Fallen solar deities and a balance of light darkness as a sort of religious idea of organizing stories for gullible masses. That's how the ancient mystery cults, pre-Christian, had as a key formula of control. So what is this Apollo, this axis? Well, this is an axis of churches, mostly in holy sites, that stretch from Skellig Michael in Ireland all the way down through England, through sites of St. Michael's Mount, the Mont Saint-Michel in France, in Normandy, Bourges Cathedral, all the way down to, past Delphi, you got their Corpus, the Temple of Assisi, and then Mount Carmel and Megiddo, which is a certain land people might have some familiar with. And these sites were built up according to a celestial phenomenon of the sun being in a certain location on the summer solstice of each year. That creates a certain kind of like line. If you take the second degree of motion of the sun at those times throughout the course of the year, you'll be able to mark out the motion of that sun. That became known as the Apollo axis, or the solar axis, or the axis of St. Michael, because most of those holy sites were built in devotion to Archangel Michael. What's that?
When was Armageddon named, and like who named it?
Well, the Battle of Megiddo is a story that comes up in the book of Revelations, but that place as location existed way before that, right? But keep in mind, and the story, as the story goes in the book of Revelations, is that you have Gog and Magog clashing in that particular geographical location, and then there's a big dispute over what do they represent, right? That's where it's all up in the air. But that's like the fact that the city of London has chosen those particular entities as their protectors, with one of them representing like a phoenixing emerging order of chaos, and the re-empowerment of the city of London. That's a bad anomaly. And let's just look at a few examples, okay? So people might have seen Star Wars.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, if you've seen more recent three, I'm really sorry for you guys that you used hours. But when Luke Skywalker becomes a jaded baby boomer nihilist and finds himself in a certain monastery, and won't train this girl, right? And has like only 3 books to read, these 3 holy books to read. It's all he has in this giant island that he's been on for like 20 years. And she's like, what's in the books? He's like, I've never read them. Come on, really? So anyway, the location selected was Skellig Michael. And the fact that you have the idea that Joseph Campbell used when he created and formulated the foundations of Star Wars originally, or not Joseph Campbell, when Joseph Campbell influenced George Lucas, who was a disciple of Joseph Campbell. But when he was formulating the ideas of Star Wars, he was explicitly trying to emulate a story of modern Grail knights, Grail myths, that animated the medieval chivalric romances of Eleanor Aquitaine, who financed a lot of these stories of chivalric knights going to fight dragons and saving damsels and all these things. That was a big recruitment tool for getting people to be recruited into higher ordering processes of the Knights Templar, Knights of Malta, and other things. Teutonic Knights being one. So that's the actual monastery. It's still populated by some monks. It's not that useful anymore, but it's a thing. It was founded in the 8th century. A lot of the stories of these early monasteries are not fully. A lot of the stories have been erased, but it was around the 8th century in the tip of Ireland, just a few miles east along that Apollo St. Michael axis. We have St. Michael's Mount, built in the 8th century. It was a Benedictine monastery. The Benedictines, by the way, were set up in the 526 or so, when St. Benedict, a member of the Roman patrician class with his twin sister Scholastica, had a sight, a vision within a cave, where he stayed for 3 years, and was overseen by certain patrician handlers and came out with his obsession to create a new order. And he was given immediately, and his order was immediately given the Isle of Capri by Tertullo, who was a leading member of the patrician families of Rome who owned the Isle of Capri. The Isle of Capri was the Tiberius Isle where all of the weird worshipping of Apollo and Dionysius was going on. Still, you see the remnants of Juno and Judo and Mithra that are still cult centers that have tons of caves inside the Isle of Capri, very influential. But it was the Benedictines who got that. And I don't think that that's a coincidence, that the Benedictines come up so much in the creation of these specific monasteries, including Mont Saint-Michel of the 8th century. Now, admittedly, the architecture here was built up in the 13th century. There was a former monastery on this very site, same name, just got more pretty. But that's on the Normandy side. Very impressive buildings. I mean, I think that might be the basis for like a Walt Disney logo or something, which itself has weird implications.
I can't remember.
You go further east. You got the Bourges Cathedral, built in the 9th century, then reconstructed in the 12th century. Again, this was Eleanor Aquitaine's cathedral where she got married. She was the major patroness for the Grail mysteries that rewrote the stories of King Arthur and the Grail. So the idea of the King Arthur legends that we tend to get in popular myths are all fake. They have nothing to do with the real King Arthur himself, who fought against the Roman Empire in the 6th century. These were made up centuries after he died in order to be things that would inspire fascists like Wagner or the Nazis, pretty much, to set up their own new Templar movements, which they did. The Sacra di San Michele, Turin, Italy, 10th century Benedictines. It was also the setting for The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, a really weird story of sadomasochistic homosexual murder and mystery cults in the... anyway, pick read the book. It's a great book.
Oh, it's a great book. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a good reader, good writer.
Great movie.
Monte Gabbiano, 5th century, first cathedral to the cult of Archangel. So the very first cathedral to the cult of the Archangel Michael, which is also Benedictine, had, of course, underground grottos where people would go and worship Michael inside of caves. Again, that's 3 different variations of Michael. And I mentioned here several times Mithra. In my research, and there's more detail inside of the Revenge and Mystery cults. Guys, I'm right here. Inside of the mystery cults, the book series, I make the case that I'm pretty sure that the the society of, you can call it a religion, but it was a secret society of Mithra, which was the dominant rival of Christianity in the early first centuries of the existence of Jesus' movement, was retooled into the Archangel Michael story. And as the imagery goes of Mithra, he was brought in by Pompey, that's a rival of Julius Caesar, as Rome was losing its claim to being a republic and was being transformed into an empire. And the imagery was that Mithra was a solar deity, Sol Invictus, who was always portrayed killing a bull. He's always looking over, usually looking over at Helios, the Apollo solar deity, and looking away from, but always present, is Luna, or Venus, or Diana, the lunar deity, the goddess of the night. This is an Apollonian Dionysian cult ritual that's being expressed here through sacrifice. Now, there have been discovered about 500 Mithraeum across Europe, the Middle East, North Africa to this very day. There's a lot of them. These are just 3 of them. This one on the far left-hand side is discovered under the city of London to this very day. A lot of them tend to be found right up below temples to Cybele Attis, which was a sort of more feminine-oriented mystery cult that had the same degrees of initiation, but that welcomed more women, that had a little bit more of a sexual orientation in it. And if you wanted to be a male member, a hierophant of the Cybelian cults, you had to basically cut off your penis, pretty much, and then you could become a holy man. That was part of the thing.
Dude.
Yeah. There's actually one I'm reading that demonstrated that Abraham Lincoln's, or the guy the guy who killed John Wilkes Booth, who probably himself didn't die, was a member of an Attis cult who castrated himself as well.
So you said the transgender movement is making acolytes?
I think the transgender movement has weirder occult origins than people realize. Yeah. Yeah. These are just some of the locations of the Mithraeum that were discovered around the world, around mostly Europe and North Africa. A lot of them are found under current churches. So whether that was, people say in defense of these churches that it was built to impose or project the dominance of Christianity over its rivals, I say maybe that's true, or maybe it's just simply some of these churches became rebranded forms of Mithraeum, which still have active Mithraeum below them in their basements, as does the Basilica of St. Clemente in Rome, which is one of many churches that has protected Mithraeum underneath. It's a thing. And we see the imagery of the bull sacrifice even up to the 12th century and many of the stones of churches, including Sicily's Monreale Cathedral, that also has Mithraeum under it. I would look into, and I haven't done it yet, but I would challenge people out there who are curious to look into the origins of the Spanish bullfighting ceremonies. That's a curious one. And I think that, who's the guy who did the foundation, Dune? Frank Herbert. Frank Herbert, I think, was possibly looking into some of this stuff as part of his research when he made the House of Atreides, a house that had at its root a bullfighting sort of spirit, right? That wasn't just something done for exercise, but I think at its root there's probably something weirder to it that I don't know how to fully think about, to be honest. But and just to get across, the story, as far as the story goes, the origin story for the cult of Archangel Michael as a modern cult, because Archangel Michael existed as a persona before this, but in the current incarnation that it was given, when it was like centralized into an organizable cult that would justify the creation of organized Christian soldier movements as well as churches in a certain way. It was a story of a dude who was a pagan hunter who was trying to hunt a bull with an arrow. I don't know why you try to hunt a bull with an arrow. That doesn't seem that successful, but he was doing it. And as the story goes, the guy took a shot at the bull, and Archangel Michael came out of nowhere, deflected the arrow, and it jets him back into the guy. The bull stayed in the cave, so the bull ran into a cave and it stayed there. This dude now saw the light, and somehow that arrow transformed him to become a Christian. And so from that origin story of the retiring bull into a cave, we had then the creation of the cult of the Archangel Michael, right? That took on this new persona that was later on adopted or retweaked in the form of the orders of St. George, or St. George is an idea. And again, there's a grotto of worshippers in the modern age worshiping the sanctuary of Michael in Monte Gargano. Again, St. George killing the dragon. That was also adopted as the patron saint of the Order of the Garter in 1350s or 1340s. That's Anki and that's Horus killing Set. So that's some imagery we've already found from Egypt of Horus on a horse killing Set, represented by a dragon or a snake or some dragon snake. This 3rd, 4th century AD. So we have already, like, the motif and the idea is what's important here. So Venice was not a republic. That's the moral of the story here. Let's jump ahead a little bit. Venice is a self-policing, organizing cult control system of the world that managed the seas, that took control of Genoa, that took control of Amalfi, that became the center of a world empire around which the sun never set. They had influence all the way to Asia for centuries. And their city motto was literally, first we are Venetians, then we are Christians. What you see there is one of many of the currently still existent informant depots where anybody in the city could literally put somebody's name on a piece of paper that they want to accuse of heresy or whatever, and put it in the mouth of this thing, or often a lion, and the committee of 3 would then basically have that person disappear after a secret trial. Secret courts were big in this world. And that was it. And then people would just disappear. So everybody knew that you had freedom as long as you stayed quiet and only talked about sports, you know. Yeah, fishing. You gotta go fishing.
The weather.
Yeah. So just to get across, this began to change. So why did Venice leave Venice? Why did the oligarchy move their location, their headquarters from Venice to set up a new empire located geographically in the Dutch and the English areas? There was something that was people began to wake up after a few centuries of forever wars being financed. All sides were being financed by the leading bankers in Venice, and they basically stopped to talk to each other. Right? That's the key way to stop one of these things. You stop and you have a dialogue with the people you're about to kill, and you start talking. And you start getting a sense of where do they get their stories from, where do they get their intelligence from, and where do they get their funding from, and they start discovering that we have the same enemy that actually wants us to spend all of our time killing each other. And that happened. That by some miracle of incredible statecraft, you actually had some wise people organized by the mentor of Thomas More, Cardinal Morton, who also recruited young Erasmus of Rotterdam to be a part of a league that became the League of Cambrai. And all of the kings were organized, and the leaders in Italy and Florence, in Milan, in the Holy Roman Empire, even the papacy itself, Julius II, were all organized. France, big time, Louis the 11th, and then the 12th, were organized to say, let's stop killing each other, and let's create this league, this new alliance, to basically just declare war on Venice. And they did.
Good idea.
Very good idea. And you have some of these quotes that you get. I got this from a Webster Tarplay essay from 1980, and he just picked out some amazing quotes from some of these key figures, like Cosimo de' Medici, who said that association with the Venetian brings two things which have always been rejected by men of wisdom: perdition and disgrace. King Louis XII said the Venetians were traitors in human blood, traitors to the Christian faith, who have tacitly divided up the world with the Turks, who are already planning to throw bridgeheads across the Danube, the Rhine, the Seine, the Tagu, and the Ebro, attempting to reduce Europe to a province and to keep it subjugated to their armies. Pope Pius II, who actually excommunicated all of Venice, and then Julius II did the same thing, said that as among brute beasts, aquatic creatures have the least intelligence. That may be unfair to fishes, but I know.
Dolphins, especially dolphins.
Oh, yeah, very. He didn't know about dolphins, probably. So among the human beings, the Venetians are the least just and the least capable of humanity. They are hypocrites. They wish to appear as Christians before the world, but in reality, they never think of God. And except for the state, which they regard as a deity, they hold nothing sacred, nothing holy. All law and right may be violated for the sake of power. So the League of Timbray was set up in December 10, 1508, uniting the highly corruptible Pope Julius II, Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor, Louis XII, Ferdinand I of Spain, many Christian leaders in the Netherlands, and everybody, and Venice gets wiped out. Their entire fleet gets wiped out over the course of like a week. And right before the second blow can come down and finish off Venice, all of a sudden something weird happens. It's really weird. Because within a matter of like 8 months, everybody basically breaks the League of Cambrai up, starting with Pope Julius, who accepts a bribe by Venice to basically, who agreed to purchase the papal state's ownership of like, what's the molecule that uranium is derived from? Oh, no, uranium is uranium, but it's found in a molecule. There's something that was used for like stained glass. Anyway, the papacy had a lot of it, and basically Venice agreed to like buy up for like 10 times the market value all of their holdings. And Julius II said, "Okay, we're friends with Venice now." And with him, he took the Holy Roman Emperor. He took Spain, and everybody all of a sudden was allies with Venice, at war with France and Florence. And that was it. It was just like a new century of war was unleashed at that point. More than a century. In 1510, the League of Sabotage, right? And then you have a real splintering up of Christianity. You have Christianity being organized around sub-Christian, splinter groups that end up fighting each other. It gets really weird. You got the Counter-Reformation in 1534. The Jesuits are created that year with the Anglicans at the same time. All right. Jesuit reactionaries lead the Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563, with the basic principle being that no dialogue with Protestants is possible. The only approach is scorched earth. Burn, destroy, but don't actually talk to Protestants. So that type of thinking is very conducive for forever wars. Frances Yates, who's a very high-level Cambridge scholar, I think she herself is a practicing Druid from Cambridge, but she has like been assigned the right to control the narratives of what was the Renaissance and these things. And she wrote...
Not take as much time. Don't worry about it.
Okay. She wrote a book called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment that I was really happy that I read. That's a cover of the thing there with a diagram of the universe by a guy named Robert Flood, an enemy of Kepler, who basically had a cosmorotic theory of the universe. It's like his penis-centric. And it was really strange. So this is what Kepler was really obviously offended by, and he wrote an opposing book called The Harmonies of the World, which is a beautiful work that discovered some universal laws of planetary motion based on music, which was great. But his enemy was this guy. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean that.
Inside eye. So Frances actually makes a very astute point, where she makes the point that, and the garbage, the lie that she puts out in her otherwise very useful book, is that all Renaissance thinking is magical thinking, that the Renaissance was driven by Rosicrucians, that the Rosicrucians, who were the sort of modern magicians or neo-Templars, were those who gave rise to everything good. That's her thesis. And she plugs bad people and good people into the Rosicrucian sort of box without proving anything she's saying. But that's the thesis. Everything good comes from magic. So she says, though, and I think she's correct about this, that yet of all the branches of the Roman Catholic Church, it was the Jesuits who were the most like the Rosicrucians. The Jesuits were the ones who had just infiltrated the Catholic Church and turned it into this hard-line, neurotically tyrannical movement of inquisitors burning witches and just like scorched earth. That thing that was making Christianity as rigid and tyrannical as possible was largely due in big measure, to this Rosicrucian infiltration that dominated the Habsburg Empire. But she's now saying that the Rosicrucians were the most like the Jesuits. How is that? The Rosicrucians were all about like ritual sex magic and all sorts of like weird stuff. What she taught them. So the Renaissance esoteric influences behind the formation of the Jesuit order have not yet been fully studied. The order made great use of the Hermetic tradition in appealing to Protestants and to the many other creeds which it encountered in its missionary work. The Hermetic and the occult philosophy of the Jesuits received a tremendous formulation in the work of Athenaeus Kircher, whose vast work on Hermetic pseudo-Egyptology was published in 1652 and who constantly cites with profound reverence the supposed ancient Egyptian priest Hermes Trismegistus. Through their common attachment to Hermetic tradition, the Jesuits and the Rosicrucians were thus foes with a love-hate relationship through a kind of similarity. We have seen that in the Führer, I'll say what that is, the Jesuits tried to draw over Rosicrucian symbolism, suggesting that the two orders were the same and manufacturing similar emblematics. So the issues could become confused, for sure. Now, what was the Führer she's talking about? So the Rosicrucians came to the fore in 1614 publicly. They already existed in a different way, but they made themselves public with a series of pamphlets called the Fama, the Confessio, and the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, a fictional character. And in these pamphlets that circulated, they kind of like went viral, I guess you could say. That was like the closest thing to viral you could imagine. Everyone was reading these pamphlets, which were talking about a new golden age among us, and a secret army of enlightened soldiers was already moving to overthrow the tyranny of the Habsburg Empire and usher in this golden age. And you know, it would never say who these people were, but they had it all under control. So don't worry, just trust the plan. It's all under control. And Frederick V becomes this sort of indoctrinated wannabe deity figure who's convinced by handlers that he and his wife, Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of James II, are divinely endowed to usher in this new age. And he's the head, he happens to be the head of the Protestant League. Now, the Protestant League that he's heading is a hugely influential thing. All of a sudden, murders a bunch of representatives of the Habsburg embassies, throws them out of a window. The people are somehow organized to demand that this guy endow himself to become the new emperor, which he says yes to, which lasts for about 2 seconds. Because at that moment, in 1619, when he says yes, all of a sudden now the Habsburgs are like really pissed. So that welcomes in now an age of bloodletting called the 30 Years' War, of which there's something like 16 million Christians who are like wiped out. And it's 30 years of Catholics versus killing Protestants and vice versa, nonstop. And that was one of the key guys around this, was this guy Michael Meyer, who's both advising James II and he's advising Frederick V. This Michael Meyer Rosicrucian, who initiates or organizes this theory of the phoenix, the phoenixing formula, the alchemical phoenixing formula, breaking down in order to recombine. We also see this on the arms of Baphomet as portrayed by Eliphas Levi, right? The goat-headed, like, androgynous deity that's pointing to the sun and to the moon with a little tattoo saying to break up and to recombine. That's called, so that's a geopolitical spiritual alchemy that these guys are big on. But it can only work if you give people something controllable to rebel against, right? Give them like a great reset technocracy that creates pressure in order to then make people lose their minds so that all they can do is fight, but you control what type of channels they will use to express their energy to fight back with. And that's the key thing that causes a legitimate revolution from turning into an illegitimate sort of bloodbath, which Cynthia is going to be going through in her presentation on the French Revolution. So in the midst of this chaos and bloodbath, that's when Venice now is taking the time to transmit its operations from Venice, which then get retooled into their infusion into Amsterdam, which sets up the first bourse, the stock exchange. The Bank of Amsterdam is quickly set up in 1609, modeled on the Venetian Levant Company and the Banco Siena. The Venetian Levant Company also forms a new basis for the creation of the Dutch East India Company, which also works then in tandem, first as rivals, but then together with the British East India Company, which is being set up by people like John Dee or Francis Bacon. Again, two figures who are leading this Rosicrucian takeover. And you know, what do? They innovate a new type of global control of power projection using economic warfare, which involves turning the economy, getting people to think that the economy is the markets, getting to think about the idea that my selfish desires is what makes the world move and makes profit happen. And if you think that without the idea of the general good, and you just want to make money with principles of gambling, you create the tulip bubble. And the tulip bubble all of a sudden had people like trading castles for tulips or papers representing tulips, which was, I mean, you just, the graphs here went from like, you know, from nothing to, in 1634 to, again, people were selling castles for tulips. And only those in the know who were like laughing at everybody knew that this was a wealth transfer when they were preparing to blow up the bubble and cause a transfer of wealth. So the people who made this lie happen knew that tulips were not worth more than tulips. And in the context of that, they were able to reformulate their activities in Amsterdam, and then use their new powers, both with the Venetian power inside of England itself, and then building itself up over the earlier 150 years since Henry VIII went and created his own thing, and you know, anyway, that's a whole set. They basically did the Glorious Revolution, which is what we heard at the very beginning from Benjamin Disraeli when he referenced the 1688 takeover that ensuring the power of the City of London and the Bank of England is the center of world power. Now, just to be quick, last 10 minutes, why did the USA break the cycle? So with all of the chaos operations that these guys were able to do with their phoenixing, why did the USA, why does it remain amongst one of the few cases, and there's very few, where a revolution happened and it didn't go into a bloody terror that resulted in something worse? Why? Just to get across, you had to think like Ben Franklin. So Ben Franklin was a guy, he was a scientist. His discoveries in electricity were directly tied to his ideas of natural law and government. He was able to organize a movement of like-minded thinkers to create a culture of brilliance and inquiry that was able to look at the laws of nature philosophically and see that we're all made in the image of God, and that we all had the power of discovering God's creation if we chose to accept certain responsibilities. In England, he set up in Manchester the Lunar Society, which involved some of the greatest scientists and industrialists that gave rise to the Manchester Industrial Revolution that was later polluted by British rapacious imperialists. But the idea is that they couldn't create this themselves. They had to have something, a way of thinking outside of their kakistocratic system that could create these types of leaps in progress that would then allow for society to support more people at higher qualities of life. I'm not going to read this because I went on way too long already, but Ben Franklin did everything. This guy was thinking about upshifting the culture in a serious way with a very long game in mind. Created the first fire departments, libraries. I mean, his work with the Poor Richard's Almanac. I'll just give you the PowerPoint. You don't have to take a picture.
Okay, good.
Okay. He was trying to introduce high poetry and literature, bringing in Confucian literature, like Analects were being brought in, translated by Ben Franklin, and brought to the colonists as well. So you had a power of thinking that you didn't have in Quebec with the French, you didn't have it anywhere in Europe, of a literacy and a love of ideas and culture in farmers. Like, that's what we call the Latin-based farmers. So they could read the Bible in Latin, they could speak in Greek. That cultural level gave them the ability to understand, why should I fight for ideas like liberty? When it's, you know, even at the risk of my comfort in my life. That took a very high level of thinking. Again, like Ben Franklin was really representing, he was British, he identified as an English guy. But he was identifying as the better England, the England of these guys, of Erasmus, of Thomas More, of Raleigh. And he made the point too that we needed an economy, a science economy that's going to allow for the actualization of these ideals. Having ideals is one thing, but being able to do it is another. So you need an economy that's going to permit you the ability to support your people and to liberate your people so that they can participate in the unfolding of the society as a whole. And going back to his writing on paper scripts and on the necessity of a paper currency in 1729, he was already describing how we have no poorhouses in the colonies. And if we had some, there would be nobody to put them in, since there is in the colonies not a single unemployed person, neither beggars nor tramps. In the colonies, we issue our own paper, and it's called colonial scrip. We issue it in proper proportion to make the goods and pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating ourselves our own paper money, we control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay to no one. And this idea gave rise to a school of economic thinking that Benjamin Franklin really oversaw in the form of people like Clay, Hamilton, Henry C. Carey, Matthew Carey, John Quincy Adams, Lincoln, and his greenbacks, that was always perfected and allowed for a greater idea of both the general welfare and the freedom of the individual to both improve at the same time, not one at the expense of the other. Which is what modern textbooks have been working very hard at obscuring and destroying as an idea. And again, he was bringing in, he was asked, what inspires you to be who you are? He says, I try to emulate my life. I try to be as much as Confucius, Socrates, and Jesus. He said those three figures were what guides his standards in life and decision making. And just to get across, it wasn't just a bunch of colonists going at it alone, right? If that wouldn't have worked, it was just that. You had an international dynamic that made this happen, of people like von Steuben. You had people like Kosciuszko from Poland, the Prussian general. You had Lafayette, the French general, leading contingents of over 1,000 French experienced fighters to go and support Franklin and the Americans in their aspirations. You had Russia without the support of Dashkova, thank you. Ekaterina Dashkova, the president of the Russian Academy of Sciences, the first and I think the only female president and reformer of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Without her and her ally Catherine the Great, you wouldn't have been able to have an American Revolution. He was thinking about building networks and allies that were able to have a similar idea of the type of society that we wanted to bring into being. And Ekaterina was made the first Russian member of Benjamin Franklin's Philosophical Society from Philadelphia. And he was made the first American member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And so that was what created the League of Armed Neutrality that guaranteed that the American colonists would receive the goods, the support, the guns, the munitions that they required in order to fight out their battle against the world's biggest empire, which became the Venetian Anglo Empire as it was. And it wasn't even just Europeans. It wasn't just Irish generals who did come down in many numbers from Ireland to fight, but it was also the Muslim leaders, Hyder Ali, who with his son Tipu Sultan were organizing the massive Mysore rebellion against the British Empire in the 1780s and 90s. These guys innovated the science of rocketry in destroying these organized columns of British soldiers in massive numbers. Great, and the British had to took them another 20 years to reverse engineer these Indian innovations to finally make their own rockets, but they didn't make it themselves. They had to steal it from actual freedom fighters. And we have here a photograph of the French ambassador Suffren working with Hyder Ali, creating this alliance, where then, because of their choice, they were able to absorb 20% of the British naval fleet that couldn't then put down the American Revolution. And Tipu Sultan even sent his son, another leader, sent the letters to the Continental Congress in 1782 saying that your fight is our fight. Every blow that is struck in the cause of American liberty throughout the world, in France, in India, and elsewhere, and so long as a single insolent savage tyrant remains, the struggle shall continue, says Muslim Indian leader Tipu Sultan in writing to the Continental Congress of the United States. That's why the first flagship of the U.S. Navy was known as the Hyder Ali that George Washington inaugurated. That's just a great picture. That's actually the NASA buildings of the origins of rocketry. Right, that's the Tipu Sultan quote. Emperor Sidi Muhammad, right, of Morocco, had a special relationship where he was the first nation in the world to recognize the independence of the United States as an independent nation, as a republic. The very first nation in 1777. And he provided massive support and protection to Barbary pirates, to American shipping that otherwise were being used as proxies by the British Empire to go and destroy American ships on high seas. And he provided all of these ships protection based on his special relationship. So I think that's a great place to end my part of the presentation today, and it did go on for an hour and 28 minutes, but that's okay.
Have permission.
But then thank you. I did. You're all witness. And but then the question then is why did this fail to successfully reproduce itself in other parts of the world that were so inspired by the success of the American revolutionaries, right? Why did the French fail when they had such when the American example could not have been possible were it not for the influence of the French, of Louis XVI, of Lafayette, so many others? Why did it fail there? Why did it turn so quickly into a bloodbath of civil war? Why did that same trend then result in a new tyranny of a Napoleon Sun King, right? That then ushered in more years of forever wars. Why did it fail in other places? So, and how does that tie into the current world that we're living in today, right? So with that, I think a good intermezzo is in order for people to stand up, maybe stretch if they want, get a drink, take a pee, and then we'll transition into Cynthia Chung for part 2. All right.
That's fantastic.